Hi, everyone. My name is Salomé, and I work at Pivotal. Welcome to our panel. Today is a very exciting day, not only because I get to talk to some of my favorite leaders in design, but also because we're launching our Pivotal Design Guide, which is the overview of our agile and user-centered practices. So, yeah, super exciting. I bring this up because today's topics are going to center around these discussion topics, and so all of that is going to be covered in this book. But since I'll be moderating this panel and won't have too much of a chance to talk about how Pivotal approaches these things, I wanted you all to be able to download the book using this QR code or go to pivotal.io/design. I'll leave this up so you can have some time to take a picture and scan it. So the reason we're all here today is to talk about why companies that lead with design are outperforming companies that are not. Today's journey is going to center around what is the value of design, demystify this squishy term that we often find hard to define, then talk about its value in leadership, why we should invest in design leadership, and then how are we measuring the efforts in design leadership. And then we're going to give you some tangible next steps that you can either begin your design journey or strengthen it. To do this, I have invited some great minds from the field to invite them to come up here on stage, and I'm going to invite them one by one. First off, I have Meriah Garret. Meriah, come up here. Yeah. Meriah is the Chief Design Officer at USAA. She is the first person to fill this seat at USAA, so I'm very excited to talk to Meriah, talk about her journey to becoming the Chief Design Officer and how she's leading her team of 250 designers.
Thanks.
Next up, I have Jehad Affoneh. Come up here. The next one. Jehad is the Senior Director and Head of Design at VMware. Quick fact about Jehad, he started his career in engineering, and then since then he's moved to design, and he's leading a team of 150 designers. And he's no stranger to scaling design, which is super interesting. You grew your team from 15 to 150, and so I'm really excited to hear about that. Last but not least, we have Adam Fry-Pierce. Adam, join me on stage. Adam has helped many companies with his background in organizational design, but in the past few years, he's joined InVision, and he's behind some of the most valuable educational platforms like designbetter.co, and also Design Leadership Forum, which is a community of 2,000 plus design leaders and executives. So safe to say, Adam knows almost every design leader on the planet. So welcome. Thank you so much for joining me at Spring One. Yeah, of course. But before we dive in, I wanted to just get a sense of the room from the audience. How many designers do we have in the audience? Oh, quite a bit. Basically every designer at Spring One is here. How many engineers? Okay, so quite a bit, as expected. Product? Nice. And other? So I wanted to start off, given the audience and the audience back home who's going to be watching this, let's start off by talking about what do we mean when we talk about design. And I thought a good way to do that would be to demystify some of the things that we've heard about, some of the biggest misconceptions about design. So let's start with you, Meriah. What is the biggest misconception about design that you want to clarify for our audience today?
I think the biggest misconception is that it's just the way it looks. And yes, that end product matters, but it's actually about the thinking, the process, the being human-centered that goes into it that I think is what we're talking about when we're talking about the discipline design. So when you look up the kind of dictionary definition of design, it's the thoughtful consideration and intentional creation of something for a purpose. And that's what we're always discussing is this, what are we making and why? And I think that the other misconception is that it's just one role's job and that there's conflict when we talk about, architectural design versus code design. Actually, everybody can contribute But design is the one that's ended up with this moniker for our discipline. It is a valid discipline that is equal to engineering, and yet it's also something that we have to democratize and make a little bit more available to everyone.
That's amazing. What about you, Jehad? What are some of the misconceptions about design that you
Along
have?
the same lines. I think the UX versus UI conversation is one I probably have once a week. With engineering and PM teams and other teams in the company of UX does not equal UI, and a good UI does not mean we have a good UX. But I think kind of slightly different perspective on or slightly kind of additional to this is the idea that design, although the design team has the responsibility of delivering the process, most of the time the deliverables of the design process, everybody designs. One of my now a fun story to tell, wasn't really fun at the time, but when I started leading the design team at VMware, I sat down in a conversation with an engineering leader in the organization who came and said, we've built the backend, we're done, we've architected the system, now we're ready for the design team to engage. And it kind of was this sit down and have a conversation about you've already done the design, and if it's great, that's fine, but the understanding that you've actually built the system equals you've made a big portion of the user experience decisions that we needed to sit down and discuss, they've now already made, was kind of an eye-opening moment for both of us and define our relationship, which is really great right now.
So what did that conversation look like?
I think it was mostly about, I think that there is in organizations, VMware included at least as a few years ago, there is a separation between disciplines that is most of the time artificial as a result of we need people to own accountability and outcome versus this is actually how the process should work. Where we need to build architecture, and architecture is owned by engineering, so engineering gets to make architectural decisions, which kind of makes sense overall. But it starts breaking down, as you say, these architectural decisions are actually the fundamentals of what user experience we are able to build. Because at some point, you're taking off user experience decisions off the table, the more deeper you're into the architecture. Same true for business as we decide on business decisions. And sitting down and kind of breaking that conversation and saying, how does the design team engage was really important. And removing kind of that black box of designers go into a room, come back with a mock-up, and it's great, and then we move forward was most of the gist of that conversation.
That's great. Yeah. How about you, Adam? Anything to add to?
Yeah, what haven't they said? So similar to what Meriah and Jehad said is, especially for non-designers, when that term comes up, what I've heard is a lot of people think of it as how something looks. It's the aesthetics of a thing. It's the surface of a thing. When in reality, what design is it's a discipline. And in it, there are innovative frameworks that allow us to take the human and put it at the center of every problem and opportunity that we're trying to solve for. And that de-risks product launches. It de-risks your brand expansion. It can de-risk a lot of things for the business. So it's the biggest misconception. It's a lot more than how something looks.
So in your role at InVision, you encounter thousands of different companies and teams. So I imagine that you see designers in the field actually doing their job, and you see how they're being utilized. Are you seeing these misconceptions play out in the field?
Yeah, oh yeah, for sure. For everyone that doesn't know what InVision is, might help for some context. So we're a prototyping collaboration tool software, and we're used by a bunch of different companies all over the world. 100% of the Fortune 500 use us, and a whole lot more than that. The reason I say it is we have a really unique vantage point into all companies of shapes and sizes across all different verticals to really see how design's operating in the modern tech landscape. And the thing that we've seen is that if you look at a business and the kind of business design, the organizational design of it, up at the very top you'll have the C-suite, and they're doing things like quarterly and annual planning, long-term, maybe 5-year planning, and trying to figure out how to guide the brand to be in that position that they want it to be in based on those timelines. And then somewhere down the line, you've got the product level, the stuff that the company is shipping out, whether it's features or widgets, apps, whatever it is. And we find that typically design is still stuck at this level. And if you're to splice that level open, go with me and just imagine a product life cycle. At the beginning of a product lifecycle, design's typically not part of that process. You'll have a product manager or a business owner have an idea, they'll sell the vision for it, get all the resourcing, PMs, you'll know what I'm talking about here. And then a lot of design departments right now, what happens is they're brought in pretty far downstream to be able to offer the kind of value that they could have had they been partnered with earlier in that process. In some environments, there's even still the waterfall set up. So the entire app is thrown over the wall to the design department. They're asked to make a sexy interface and to make it look good. And so that's all to say that design is not able to offer as much value not only to the product life cycle that we're just talking about, but to the business as a whole in its current form.
Sounds very similar to the example that Jehad was sharing with us. So going back to this idea of value, I imagine that looks very different in your companies because you both at USAA and VMware has been partaking in a lot of investment in design and design transformation, especially like in your case, Meriah, in the past, I guess, 4 or 5 years?
3.5 now.
3.5, okay. 3.5 years, there's been significant investment in design. And so I'm just curious to know, what was that, what does that look like? What does design offer in terms of value to USAA? Why did they invest in design? And what value have you been able to deliver to the engineering and product counterparts and like ultimately the customers?
Yeah, it's a great question. And I can answer it in multiple ways. So one, there was the business case that needed to be created for the company to even make the investment. And some of that was a competitive landscape, what organizations are doing across, and the idea that without some kind of skill set in this and capability, we would be left behind in the market in terms of driving relevance, in terms of making usable software. And so that was something that I used a bunch of data from the market to help create. And then now that, I got the title, but it came with no headcount and it came with no budget. I had to initially go do that. But now that we've grown our headcount from, we were a much smaller number to the 250, 300 with contractors, it's about delivering value on a continuous basis. And I think one of the misnomers that I see over and over again within the industry, and people have tried to tackle it head on, right? Forrester did their value of design thinking at IBM. McKinsey did their recent report. InVision has a great report that's fantastic. But the misnomer I see over and over again is people trying to uniquely label the value of design as a discipline. And I think fundamentally, if you're doing it well, you can't have your own OKRs or KPIs or whatever you want to say that are completely independent of your business partners. And so, and I feel like we've started to get there further on dev teams. And that, yes, you may measure velocity or quality or some of those other kinds of things, but you don't ask a dev team to say, what have you delivered? And don't talk to me about the business goals. And so the same is true for design. Now, what you would say is in the interest of those business goals, whether that's reduction of calls or error rates or continued flow through on an acquisition, whatever your specific metrics are that you're trying to drive for a given product or experience, design can help you enhance that.
Right.
And so I think that that's the thing that I've tried to say over and over again is I can measure organizationally our productivity, our skill sets, our proficiency, but I cannot measure outcomes. And that's been really hard for the company to understand, but we've finally kind of gotten there. And you want my outcomes to be your outcomes, right? I want to be measured based on your success rather than have some separate discipline level success.
So what does a common definition of good look like in that scenario? Like how does your team know that you're doing something that is adding value if it's hard to measure? Like what are some of the things that you see tangibly different than it was before?
Yeah, so one of the things we try to measure is, are we doing generative research at the right times? And do we know enough about the assumptions that are being made to actually go and create something? We work in the scaled agile or SAFe model, which for some people it's just less agile, but it works for USAA. It's actually given us a lot of runway to start to say, here's how we engage at the portfolio level that's different. Here's how we engage at the program level that's different. And so we try to have most of our work, at least 60% of our features come in at the epic level and be engaged at that portfolio layer. So that is a measure of what we consider good. And then we try to make sure that of the quality that's going out the kind of the back end of the door, that we're saying we're having large amounts of reuse of the design language system, and that we're hitting all of our accessibility metrics. So I own digital accessibility risk for the entire company, and we have some key controls that we've put in to the software development lifecycle to say, okay, it's wonderful if we're designing something accessible, which we do through a foundational review, but are we actually delivering something that's accessible? So we're actually part of the quality assurance process to make sure that that's happening. Accessibility is the one that we can really hit the nail on the head from a compliance perspective, which always resonates in financial services, but we use that as a moment to ensure other types of quality as well.
Right. You speak this in terms of relevance. You mentioned that relevance in companies staying relevant. The title of the session is the X factor in transformation. So what is the value of design and transformation in staying relevant? Anyone can take this on, whoever.
I can start.
Yeah.
I think one of the things that when we started on this transformation at VMware, one of the things that we tied our design transformation into is the transformation of the company itself into a services-based, subscriptions-based, SaaS-based company overall. And the reason is it was really difficult. So VMware, kind of to give you a little bit of context, VMware is pretty customer-oriented internally. Our CFO makes the joke all the time that if you want to get out of any meeting at VMware, just say I have a customer meeting, and everyone just lets you leave. And I've used this a couple of times. But in a company like that, it's really hard to come and say, I own the user experience, or I'm the customer voice. Everybody's the customer voice. So that's not necessarily, you can start discussing what does that mean, and what does owning the customer voice in different angles and perspectives, but that's not really a strong point to make. One of the things that mattered really to us is as we transform into a subscriptions and services company, how we build products really, really matters. How you build them fast, how you deliver them, how you iterate on them, how you make decisions often, how do you have the North Star, but at the same time have pieces of that built over time. These things that when you build products and you have 12 and 18 and 24 months product cycles, you don't really have to think about that much, start making a difference. And we aligned design with that internal transformation itself. And we said design can come in and help you iterate faster. A prototype is not necessarily code. We can build a prototype with InVision or other software and test it with customers, figure out what's wrong, and come back before we even write a single line of code. We don't have to architect and re-architect and re-architect. This can happen at the design phase. These things really resonate in an engineering-driven company. And I think proving it a few times in a row makes a huge difference. I mean, we sit in conversations where we say, here's our story, the story of the service and product. And it doesn't matter who built that story, but the conversation we get back from the executive team is, whatever we did here, we want to do it again. Like this is aligning the team, that's how we want to move forward. So aligning it to the transformation of the internal transformation of the company was as important as coming and saying we can build a better user experience, or the value of design is what we deliver. It's what we do and then also what we deliver. The other part is on the research side. We started doing a lot of research, and designers do research as well. Before that research was asked for, that research was acted upon. And the value of that, it's really hard to say I told you so. So like carefully saying I told you so makes a difference in the sense that we've had this information, and had we acted on it, things would have been different. A few times in a row, that makes a huge difference, because if we have this information, we should have it in the room as we make the initial decisions. There's value in discussing this information. So a lot of it is how do you tie it, at least in our case, was how do you tie it into the value of is cheaper, faster, better, and results in better user experience versus just saying trust us, the outcome is going to be great.
Yep. I'll plus one, the cheaper. One of the things that really resonated, especially at the board level, is this idea of, we're not a company as popular as it is to talk about failing fast. We're not a company that can really adopt that mindset wholly. So this idea of learning cheaply really resonates. And so if you can learn at a Post-it note, learn at a Post-it note. If you can learn at a sketch, learn at a sketch. If you can learn at a no-code prototype that took 2 days to build, let's learn at a no-code prototype. And so that's really been something that we've stood on a lot in order to talk about why it's important to engage early or closer to that moment of idea.
Right.
So taking it back to this idea of introducing design and the value of design, I imagine at an engineering-led company, there's quite a bit of friction to begin with. And so what did that look like? What are some of the things that you all did to introduce design? And basically, I guess I imagine there was some in terms of internal education with your counterparts in other disciplines.
Go ahead.
You can take whoever wants to take them.
So I'd love to be able to say, like, we had the vision 3 years ago, and, like, here's how we drew it, and, like, every piece of it was great. But, like, looking back is actually much easier than looking forward. But looking back, the way we started in our design transformation journey, at least from my perspective, is there was a product at VMware that I was working on, and one of the kind of core purposes of that product was we want to build we want to simplify the installation, upgrade, and monitoring, and so on, the initial experience of people buying and getting use of the product. And it's not really one product, it's how do we get the whole VMware portfolio to be easily integrated.
Is this Clarity?
So this is where Clarity was born out of, but this was what is now VxRail, or at the time was EvoRail, or Marvin, or whatever, if you know VMware products, what you know it by. And then we started kind of thinking, okay, if we want to simplify installation, here's how it looks like, and we started building the workflows. And then we sat down and, like, in a room, you can imagine the typical, like, stock image of a design room with post-it notes and pictures on the wall. And we realized there are fundamental pieces that are missing. In the workflow, there were screens after each other. And I know we talked about UX and UI, but this starts with UI. There are screens after each other that the OK and cancel buttons were in reversed order. So as a user, you actually had to go through this and deeply think not to make a mistake. Because if you click in the same place to accept the EULA, you're screwed, because you're actually going to say no.
I know a travel app that does this.
Yeah.
I don't want to name it.
And the funny thing, the other interesting thing is we brought in people and said, let's draw where this breaks. So, like, we just drew where things break. And you can actually draw our organizational structure as a company out of that installation workflow. Like the different BUs, the different teams, where decisions were made. I mean, the people who said this is where it breaks were not part of that. So we decided, okay, actually, most fundamental thing we need to do is standardize the visual consistency and interaction consistency, and that's where Clarity, which is our design system, was born. So it was a very small team of 3 or 4 people. We said we'll get this done in 6 months. Took us about 12, which kind of sounds right. You just estimate and then double. And then when we started delivering, I think the journey for us was as important as the outcome. This was bottoms up. There was no top-down mandate to adopt Clarity. And the journey of having to sit down day in, day out with teams across the company with hundreds of engineers and PMs and explain why this is important, why this matters, and how this impacts our business, and how we can't build products that are integrated unless we have this conversation, and why they should adopt it, and teams saying, if this team's adopt, I'll adopt. They need to go first. Like, I don't want to adopt something that others. Having these conversations, I think, although they were extremely frustrating at the time, were really, really impactful as Clarity went out, became very successful. We open sourced it. It became one of the VMware's most successful open source projects. And then that success, and now is used by every single product at VMware, that success we were able to carry on the credibility of that success and say, that was actually step 1. So now we need to actually go transform design, really. Like, now that we've solved the most basic problem, even though it didn't sound so basic. And from there, we started saying, we need to actually transform how we do this. I think that initial force function of having the conversations across the organization at a layer they understood well, like you can show it, gave us the credibility to talk about the layers you can't see.
Right, make it tangible and speak their language.
Exactly.
Before you can influence more. So Adam, I want to bring it back to the broad perspective of InVision. And so you mentioned the majority of companies that are not utilizing design in the way that they could see the most value out of. Are you similarly seeing companies, are there any that are actually leveraging design to its fullest potential?
Yeah, I mean, 2 right here, some of these examples that we just heard.
Good answer.
But so something that we do a lot of is we do a lot of industry research, figure out how teams are operating and so on and so forth. Meriah mentioned some research that you guys might be aware of, and that's the McKinsey, Business Impact of Design report. They had surveyed about 300 people in that report, and over this last year, we launched something called the New Design Frontier that was spearheaded by Leah Bewley, previous Forrester analyst. She had joined us specifically to answer this question we were trying to figure out. So we had over 2,000 companies, a lot of which were enterprise, super relevant to everybody here at this conference, trying to answer this one question, which if you're a designer, you'll know what I'm talking about, but it feels like for a long time, we've all had this inkling of, if there is a more mature design practice at an organization, we can probably offer more value to the business in some way, shape, or form, whether in the product or elsewhere. And this report, which I have right here, is it's the widening ranges report to date to try to answer that question: what is design's impact on business? And we found a statistical correlation between that statement, that the more advanced that your design practices, your organization, the more value that you can offer, both at the product level and beyond. And at the core of this study is this thing called the Design Maturity Index. And as we were gathering all these data points, we found that there was about 5 different groupings that came out of this survey to help us make sense of the findings. In this index, on the lower end, you've got less mature teams who are able only to offer so much value out to their to the enterprise. These are called level 1 teams, called producers. And they offer the kind of value that you'd think in the name, right? They're able to impact things like product usability because they are stuck at the production phase. And then up at the very top, you had less than 5% of companies out of these 2,000 that were surveyed that are classified as the visionaries. And they're able to offer as much value as you can in the modern day tech landscape as a design team. The thing, back to your question, that really, the distinctive thing that a level 5 team can do for their business in terms of value offered is they will do things like offering, like definitely impacting product usability, but they'll do more than that. They'll do things like cost savings, like what you just heard about at VMware with systematizing, operationalizing design. They'll have an impact on more obvious things as well, like customer satisfaction, and then way less obvious things, like impacting brand equity and shareholder equity. In a level 5 team, we had 52% of those teams say that they were able to have an impact directly on things like patents, which end up impacting IP and shareholder equity. The biggest difference, though, between a level 5 team and every other one is that design equals business strategy at that level. You have CEOs that have completely subscribed to the idea that every company is becoming a digital company, and therefore they need to have customer experience as a core differentiator that is going to allow them not only to change the market, but to grow it and win as they grow. So at a level 5 team, design is completely baked into every facet of the business, well outside of product. And there's typically somebody who's shepherding that growth.
I think one of the things that I would add just as color is that not every portion of your organization will be at the same level.
Yeah.
And that's particularly true in a really broad organization like ours, where we have some teams that maybe I might try to claim are kind of 5-ish, and then we have some teams that are not. And that's about the willingness for those business partners and the whole squad that has to come together, from development to, in our case, legal and compliance as well, to actually bring products to life. And are they mature as a whole? And so how can you operate there? One of the things that you were asking, like how you get started, one of the things that was true the first day I joined is I drew this kind of little map of like, well, it'll be arranged like this. And one of the things that was true on that map that's true today is we started this thing called the Human-Centered Design Team within our organization. Confusing name, I get it. But really, it was our own version of a USAA-specific D-School boot camp for other roles at the company. And we took it upon ourselves to basically manufacture better clients. But the intention was to basically use design thinking as an API to design. And I think you've heard in the industry, maybe if you've been paying attention to this whole like backlash against design thinking of, oh, it's like design light. No, it's an interface that allows all different roles to engage in this process and for design to engage more earnestly in the other portions of their process. Because really it should be one process, ultimately one squad or whatever you want to label it, that organizes around the work. And the only reason you have organizations that are defined by discipline is so that you can get the care and feeding that you need, and the career pathing and the growth and the validation, even when you're fighting against the friction of a company, that your job matters, you have somebody who cares about you, right? That's why we want discipline-based structures, not because it's actually where the work lies.
So how does this boot camp work? How many days is it? How many people go through it? Is it mandatory?
It's not mandatory. It is elective. I typically kind of feed it from the executive perspective. It's very word of mouth down at the individual contributor level. We targeted experience owners / product managers as in our first iteration, and we've gone through multiple iterations of it. So initially it was 2 days completely off-site in Austin, off-site from our home office. And we weren't able to fit in-field research in, so we took on an employee topic and immersed them in employee research. And they would get from research through synthesis, ideation, concepting, and kind of like value definition, which is one of the things we define now at our epic. Every epic has to have a lean business case, including a kind of member or employee value. Now we do probably 2 to 3 a month. And the new format that we've just gone to is not role focused, it's team focused. So we'll say, hey, person who heads auto insurance acquisition, bring all your roles and let's do what we are calling a bring your own epic version of this. And instead of giving them a problem, they bring us an epic that's actually coming up in their backlog, and we try to move it forward.
Oh, that's great. So it sounds like there's a lot of influencing happening, and tying it back to that point that you made, Adam, about like influencing and weaving in the business strategy at the executive level. I imagine there needs to be this seat at this proverbial table that you're able to actually influence your executives or have a seat at that table. So is that what you see in the industry in your report?
Yeah,
right
well
now?
done getting us back to the title of the session.
Oh, the title's, the clicker stopped working.
I guess
so
you
don't
can't
know.
do that anymore. Yeah, so the quick answer is yeah. There's been a huge rise of design leadership, in the last 5-10 years. I remember being really surprised at hearing about the first chief creative officer that I ran into, and then it felt like there was just a wave after that of chief design officer, VP of UX, head of design, global whatever. And I think it goes back to that statement that I was making earlier, is that as all companies are becoming digital companies, there's going to be a need for somebody to guard the customer experience and be the top advocate for the customer. And I think that plays out in different variations within the C-suite for sure, but there needs to be a person, and that's probably why we've seen rise in it. I mean, and you can almost look at every industry, and this is happening, but specifically, finance is one where it's probably most obvious right now. You had Citibank have their first head of design very recently, and then Visa, and
Meriah.
Meriah right here.
Bank of America now, Capital
exactly.
One.
Yeah, all these places. So I think that especially in B2C verticals, you're going to see it, and then eventually it will probably permeate into the rest of industry, because really everything's about humans anyways, right?
So yeah, this is the opportunity to talk about your position at USAA. Why does a chief design officer position exist at USAA? How did you get there? What was that journey?
A gentleman joined as the president of the bank, and he called me up, and he'd been a client of mine at Capital One who I'd done some consulting for, and he said, I'm going to USAA, and you have to come. And I was pregnant at the time and said, no, thanks. And about a year later, I did end up joining, and I think it was just, it was the right moment at this company for them to try and do something big, right? It is an extremely member-focused company. We have been about that, it's in our bones, and so it's easy to conceptually get this idea of that people are important, that you should put them at the center of some of your processes. But then the challenge of actually making things gets in the way of that. Previously at USAA, design had been a distributed function. There were about 100 designers reporting into individual IT managers, and then a very small kind of centralized unit that was doing various kind of spot projects. And so it took me a while to actually unify everybody, and we did it first spiritually, and then moved to the kind of organizational model. And the intention, I'm not a believer in hierarchy. I'm not a believer in the cult of personality. I don't think you have to have a chief design officer to be successful at a given company. But I think the thing that is true is you have to know the forces of gravity within your organization and think about the tactics that are the best way to fight them. And so if you have an organization that is really very flat and can be extremely just pure talent-based, and the squads form naturally, amazing, embrace that. if you have an organization that's used to hierarchy in other disciplines, you may need to create hierarchy in this discipline in order to validate those humans, to advance the practice. We did a lot of work around standardization, both in the design language system, but also the methodology, lots of training and education, and then lots of attracting and hiring. And having the role, not necessarily particularly me, but the role meant that it was easier to attract and hire at the rate that we needed to. And then it also helped change that conversation and bring just emphasis and energy to the discipline, such that when a team was hitting a roadblock, I started to call it positive escalation, right? It's not that I've got a magic wand, but somehow if I go to that other vice president and say, hey, like we're not talking on the same, here's the value you can get from this organization, here's what how you can engage with us, it shifted the energy, and the team would see a difference within a couple of days. And then they're proving their own worth on a day-to-day basis, right? I don't have to be there to hold their hands. But sometimes they need the door a little bit more cracked. And that is something that I think that at times when a company needs it, that role can do. And there's many ways. If you are an organization that has many different products, you might do better to have an executive over each product if you're not interacting across those products, right? Intuit did that for a long time. They had a VP over small business and a VP over, the accountant experience. And now they've just gone to this chief design officer again of product and design as another pendulum swing. So there's multiple ways to organize it, but I think it's knowing the gravity in your own organization and thinking about what are your counterweights.
That's well said. Jehad, we had a conversation offline about this, and we talked about how you have centralized practices at VMware. And what are your thoughts about organizations where design rolls up to engineering or product? What's your perspective?
Yeah. I have a pretty strong feeling about this, as you'll be able to tell. But I think it really depends on the company or industry and things like that. But I think it really speaks to how the company values design, which is the most obvious way for a designer or a candidate or someone talented who wants to join the team to make a decision. Mm-hmm. So I think when we look at the InVision report, I forgot the percentage, but 50-60+% of talented designer, one of their top decisions is, am I going to be reporting to design leadership? Mm-hmm. Because at the end of the day, there is that healthy tension between different disciplines and teams that happens in an organization that you want to happen, between engineering and PM, between engineering, PM, and design, and so on and so forth. And that tension is very unlikely to happen if my bonus depends on the person I'm trying to tell we should go in a different direction or we should disagree. This is more true for the more junior you go into the career ladder, because you're fighting a fight with the teams that you're supposed to be your close team. You're supposed to, you're on this side, even though it shouldn't be sides. But so I think one of the things we're really focusing on, and we're not 100% centralized yet, especially with acquisitions and things like that. But one of the things we're really focused on is how do we build a world-class design organization? And there isn't a single answer to this, but we need to build a world-class design organization within VMware. What we discovered is that early on, as you're trying to build that organization, one of the best way to do it is to bring designers together and build a clear understanding of what is design, what is the process, what does design look like, build the kind of the culture in the company that it's okay for design to push back on PM and engineering. And what we found is actually this culture is really hard to build unless you have that protection to the top. So my theory is that centralizing design is not necessarily the most important thing. It's how do you make sure that design is respected as an equal partner to PM and engineering versus reporting to either? And then how do you change your org structure as the organization's maturity changes? So for example, if in 5 or 10 years VMware is an experience-led company and design we have the number of designers we need and we have the processes that we need, you could definitely, in fact, most probably would, in a company like VMware, you would decentralize design into different, whatever the structure is, business units or different things. But today, as we look at it, For example, if I look at business unit X, without naming a specific one, but in my mind, I'm looking at a general manager of the business unit, that's VMware structure. You have a VP of product management, a VP of engineering, and then today, a senior manager of product design. So your options are one of two things. You have that report to one of the two VPs, or some of the other disciplines that are not really part of the product development process, or you actually have some level of design leadership that can have that equal partnership at that level. Generally, it's easier to centralize first, get that leadership, get that power, change the culture, and then you could go and decentralize or keep centralized. It becomes less important. But the one thing I wouldn't do, especially in a technology company, is have design a function of either engineering or PM. Because on PM, it turns generally into kind of a business function. How do we do these things to push the business forward? In engineering, the business forward in the sense of like, we need X sales, or we need X revenue, or we need to build this product by this timeline, and that's what design's main goal becomes. Or in engineering, it moves towards what does design need to do so the engineering team can continue to move forward, which is really the wrong methodology when you think about design. Moving the engineering team forward or any other team forward isn't the responsibility. It's the responsibility of the wider team, not a specific discipline.
So what's the goals at VMware for design? And I know I want to bring it back to demonstrating the return on investment, and I know that's like a lot of pressure is coming from external from the industry, because we have research from McKinsey and Forrester and InVision, and as we talk about design to our counterparts, they have metrics that they're tied to. So if it's harder to measure and it's harder to tease out its value, like what are some of the specific things that you're tracking right now at VMware?
Yeah, I think, so you mentioned seat at the table, kind of to bring it back. I'm not a huge fan of the term. I think you earn your seat at the table. Nobody deserves a seat at the table, whatever that table is. But I think one of the things that, and again, I'm speaking from my experience at VMware, one of the things that I realized over the last 3 years is there are a lot of things that we haven't done because we haven't tried versus they were shut down. Like, there's this theory that I read at some point that if you close a door and don't lock it, most people won't try to open it because they'd assume it's locked. Even though if you open it, you actually have access to the room. So one of the things, like initially, early on when I started leading the design team, I came and I said, we need a conversation with the CEO, and I sent an email to his chief of staff ready to go through the fight if we need the time and we're worth the time. And Pat, who's our CEO, Pat's chief of staff responded and said, 7 a.m. on 3 weeks later, does that work? I was kind of like, wait, I'm not sure I'm ready 3 weeks later. I thought it would take longer. So if you're fighting for the seat at the table, be ready to know what do you want to talk about. But I think one of the questions Pat asked afterwards is, how do we build a world-class design organization? And whether he asked it because he believed in it, whether he asked it because he was being nice. Either way, we took that and actually materialized it into here's what that looks like. And that's been driving actually the vision for the last couple of years. But that door wasn't closed to begin with. But to measurements, I think it's really hard. There are measurements that we use as VMware that are not specific to design, but design impacts like PSAT, product satisfaction and customer satisfaction, PSAT and CSAT. There are measurements that we build internally. We have something we're working on called user, which is an acronym for usage and adoption and ramping up and so on and so forth. But I think the true measurement that I found the most useful as you grow a design team is the value that other teams in the company put on you. And there's a huge difference between me standing up at VMware in an e-staff meeting or in an executive meeting and saying the design team is great, because that's most likely what I'm going to say, versus engineering teams and PM teams standing up and saying, I can't do my job without deeper involvement from the design team.
100%.
Yes.
And getting there is a lot of relationship building and conversations and education and training, but that actually has far more value than look at this score, we were able to move it from X to Y. Because there isn't a score that anybody in the executive team cares about that's design only. PSAT and CSAT and NPS and all of these things change. We could screw up our support and our NPS would change. It's really hard to say that's why. So the one value you want to put, I think, the one metric you want to track is how do other teams feel not just feel, how do other teams benefit from what you're providing, and what can you do? How can you do a better job to earn your seat at every table, from your cross-functional team to the executive team?
So Adam, bringing it back to the broad perspective, I'm curious if you've come across any interesting ways that companies are measuring the value of design.
You know, what's funny is the answers that I've heard. So, like you mentioned earlier, I'm really lucky to be part of this thing called the Design Leadership Forum. And so I get to hear how design leaders all over the world are measuring their success. And there is not a one-size-fits-all. There's no silver bullet whatsoever, except for there is this like general rule of things are pretty binary, right? If our peers can look at us and say, hell yes, like we're all in, we need to spend more time building these partnerships, and it's typically indicative that things have been going well. And then when it is the opposite, when it's zero, the biggest advice that design leaders will then give whoever that person is that said that thing is, well, how much are you going to them to try to learn about their objectives, right? Back to what you said is there's no seat that should be given, only earned. And I think the best way to do it is to go out and, what does the business really care about, and how can you show that design can better support or catalyze that journey, or whatever the larger roadmap is. So there's no one top-down metric. I think it is important that you have something that you're measured by, for sure. So that's the best answer I can give, is there should be, an OKR, so to speak, for whatever the top line design leadership function is. And I think that's going to be completely subjective to whatever the company is or the vertical or whatever they're serving.
So we're nearing the time, so I want to make sure that we leave some tangible advice and next steps with our audience. So if you wanted to start your design transformation journey or strengthen your design transformation journey, what advice would you give?
I'll start. So I will disagree with Meriah. I think that there does need to be somebody who's completely accountable. Like I said a couple times, is if you're a top-line strategy owner, budget owner, if there are any CEOs in the room somehow, hire a design leader if you don't have one already. And not only that, it goes beyond just hiring the person who's going to own that function. It goes into this larger strategy of socializing why design is important. And a great example of that is what Jenny did at IBM. Back when she announced to the world, we're throwing down $100 million because we are going to become an experience company. And the only way we can do that is if we have design expertise. So having that top-line design executive isn't only just about having somebody who's accountable to whatever the metrics are. It's also somebody who has the expertise, and design is uniquely positioned to best understand what the customer needs are and what the human needs are. And then they can continue to be that advocate for the business at every single level. There should be a design leader. I do agree it doesn't necessarily need to be at the C-suite. That's, I think there's probably a journey to these things, and it has to start somewhere. It's probably not going to start by automatically just giving a seat to somebody at the top, but it does need to be, that opportunity does need to come up at some place, and the higher up the better. And there are funny ways that you can do it with organizational structure to where reporting lines and comm lines are separate, but there should be some tether up to the top line business roadmap. So that's the advice for anybody who's a strategy owner in the room. If you're anybody else, saw some design hands go up, I would go back to, again, what Jehad said is, if you are looking to earn more respect, you probably need to go out and reach across the aisle to your partners in dev and product or whatever your critical partners are, and learn what's really important to their functions. And outside of your typical 40 hours, see what you can do to help support those ideas. And I think it's safe to say that everyone here is in tech. I found that there's a typical rule that it is better to ask for forgiveness and permission. And at worst, you're going to get a slap on your hands for trying to be proactive and try to add more value to whatever the other function is in the organization. And if you get in trouble for that, maybe that's not the place that you want to be.
Yeah. If you're a designer, I would say make sure that you are collaborating across your discipline as much as humanly possible. All too often, we still see people siloed by sub-role, right? The UX designers versus UI designers, or the design researchers versus the interaction designers. I actually eliminated a lot of those role variations in my org in order to intentionally say we're all the designers and it's up to each team to have a balanced skill set. But if you do have some of those divides, really intentionally seek collaboration. We are one of one of the reasons that we've stayed centralized, even though we've been through a recent kind of examination of our operating model, is because we're one of the smallest organizations that see quite the level of breadth that we do. And so we drive cohesion, not just through things like the design language system, but through the ways that we really intentionally cross-collaborate amongst teams. And so as much as the value is on each team delivering something really good, it's also on driving that collaboration and connection so that even though the design language system is much more componentized, guess what? Our confirmation pages actually look like they align to each other. And we're taking a similar approach to progressive disclosure across these these disparate flow types, et cetera, et cetera. So I think that cross-collaboration is something that is in each one of our, we all have the power to do it. And then if you're a developer, I think that you can't underestimate your ability to engage this discipline, both to participate in it, right? You have as much right to imagine what the future can be like as anybody who's drawing pixels, and in fact play a really important role in that. And I think that making that connection tighter at the team level is the actual place where you'll see the most velocity fastest. And then if you are at the place of maturity where you do not have a design language system and you're not creating that level of reuse within your organization, that is a obvious target. And so whether that's grassroots or centralized with dedicated teams or 20% of everyone's time, invest in a design language system, build out those components in code, make them actually reusable, get them in a GitHub repository, however you do it so that you can actually drive reuse within your organization, because not only is it better for the experience of your customers, but it is way better for the bottom line of your business. And if you can show that value, you're going to see a significant uptick in the kind of engagements you'll receive.
What about you, Jehad?
Yeah, I think these are all good points, so I'm not going to add too much, but I think for designers, it's actually usually ironic to me that we pride ourselves as designers on our ability to empathize with users. That's a job. You empathize with users, deeply understand their problems and what they're trying to do, and then propose solutions that help them. The funny thing is we do very little of that work with cross-functional teams. Mm-hmm. We use that skill. We get busy in the day-to-day and in the kind of like the cross-functional conversations, so on, that we do very little work of understanding what can I do to help engineering and PM teams move forward? What can I do to help other cross-functional teams move forward? Using the same disciplines and learnings that we do with customers. To some extent, they are another customer of ours as we deliver and move forward, or a partner of ours as we deliver and move forward. For engineers and PMs, I think, the research proves it, but you can take my word, and I'm sure Anna's and Meriah's word for it. Life is better in a team that's balanced with these disciplines, for many different reasons. Process is better. The types of problems you get to solve are far deeper because you're not worried about the details of things that could have been solved much earlier down the process. You're far more informed as you solve these problems. You're not spending your time on redoing things that you could have learned early on in the process and so on, which means it is the responsibility of other disciplines to stand up and have the conversation about if your current design team, if you don't have a design team, that's one place to start. If your current design team is not doing what they need to do, is to have that conversation and what needs to happen for that to change. Since I mentioned like a lot of the value comes from product and engineering teams standing up and saying this is valuable, you need to stand up and saying it's valuable when it is, and have a conversation with your design team when it's not, because that's the only way you raise the whole organization forward. And for leaders in the room or others in the room who are not design or engineering, it's I think we talk a lot about engineering-led and design-led and so on. In my mind, organizations should be experience-led. And experience is the responsibility of all disciplines. Nobody owns experience. The length of, we had conversations early on as we moved to cloud services about the length of the EULA. The length of the legal agreement had a huge impact on the user. I'm sure everybody has had that conversation at some point. But the length of the legal agreement has had a huge impact on our conversion rates and other things, which means the legal team had an impact on our experience, and we need to have a conversation. So your company should be experience-led. To do that, you need the cross-disciplines working together, and you need a design team that's strong. What can you do to actually make that happen?
Yeah,
that's great. So I've been asking a lot of questions. I want to put it to the audience to see if they have any questions that I haven't asked the panel yet. Go ahead, Becky.
Hi, I hope you can hear me.
Yeah.
I tend to be loud. You mentioned moving at USAA, removing some of the specialties in the design discipline and saying we're designers and it's up to the teams to figure out what the balance of expertise is on the team. Can you tell us a little bit more about that and like how, as some designers get more senior in their career, they want to specialize in certain areas, and how you manage that natural desire and the value of that with the generalization that's necessary in your organization?
Definitely. So for audio, just for recording, the question's about removing the specialization within our teams from a labeling perspective and how we kind of balance that versus practitioners wanting to stay somewhat specialized as they move up in their career. So it's not all specialization that we've removed. We still have a discipline of design research, even though everybody also does design research. So the researchers really act as those specialists and consultants, and then each team that is deployed to a given area, so the deposits team or the credit card team or what have you, also does research in their space, consulting that centralized group. Within the deployed design team, though, there is only the role of designer, typically in actual title, and producer. And a producer is basically a design, a creative project manager is one of the roles that we have. And we need that because of the level of kind of cross-functionality at a given design team at USAA, because our gearing ratios are still really high, maybe supporting up to 9 agile teams. And that's because of velocity and level of older systems, many reasons. So within that, we don't delineate between visual designer, interaction designer, UX versus UI designer. We've all heard like many different variations of terms. And the primary driver behind that was that most people are some form of hybrid anyway. So you either get an interaction designer who's also really passionate about information architecture and research, or a visual designer who's also really passionate about prototyping. And so you always had to end up having these asterisks next to the labels and names, and that made it really hard. So what we've done instead is talk about our competencies, which are skill sets plus, in this set of, we boiled it down to 16. I know that sounds like a lot, but it is 16 in this idea of our what. So what are the tangible things that we do every single day, and our how, the ways that we engage and accomplish that work through collaboration and emotional intelligence and many other things. And then in the what, your goal is to be spiky, and you're going to have a specialization, and that's fantastic. But that you will progress through that specialization. And then in the how, your goal is to be round. And because we always kind of want to grow pretty evenly, like, oh, I'm pretty good at collaboration, but I have low emotional intelligence. Well, how is that gonna work? It's not gonna pan out very well. And we have a small enough organization. We talk about each of our talent individually as names. And so we're able to say that we know what a given person is really good at. And if someone wants to move amongst teams or work on something different, we always try to accommodate that and end up with still a relatively balanced skill set on that landing team. I think that we see this trend a little bit in the industry, right? A lot of people moving to just this general product designer, and that requires interaction and visual and prototyping and research skills. And I think that it helps remove some of the conflicts within the team about role clarity, right? It becomes more about what's this piece of work I'm going to take down, and what do I need to do to get this job done, and who do I need to lean on based on their particular skills. It might be that somebody's a great photographer within a team. Well, we don't have a competency for photography, but guess what? That's really important on research trips. And so that person has to bring that secret skill to bear in that project. So the idea is structural simplification, but ability to embrace people throughout that. We don't have a role today, but it's in development and will be launched at the top of the year for a principal. So right now we go up to a lead designer, and then you break into kind of some management role. But the principal discipline and fellow and all the things that we see at so many companies is in development, and we will see more specialization in that, but we continue to not label it. It'll just be about that person's contributions and the way they drive participation through the whole community.
I think we have a question from one more question, time for one more question. Yes.
Sort of along the same theme in terms of building your teams and skills, as you build both with VMware on the technical skill set and in the financial services, how much industry knowledge is important to have as you build the teams? Because there's sort of maybe a perception that, just a generalist is fine, but did you find that you needed to find a balance of industry knowledge to build out the quality of people in your team?
Great question. You want to take it first? We can
Sure.
both do a quick one on it.
So I think what we look for generally is the ability to gain domain knowledge versus existing domain knowledge. There are very few designers in the world who know the virtualization business and the cloud business and like very deeply, so we'd run out of options very quickly. But the ability to, one of the things we think about is how can you show us that you've been able to jump into a domain that you're not an expert on and gain deep domain knowledge in that domain by interviewing and talking to customers, by having conversations with cross-functional teams and so on and so forth, and then be somewhat of an expert on that domain very quickly. The other part is how can we build as we grow fast, this becomes really important because you have, at VMware, 60% plus of the team joined in the last 12 months. Which means you have a huge, people who joined within the last 6 months are onboarding people who are joining today. So you have that huge kind of how do we do this right dilemma. But putting a big emphasis on retention becomes important. So as you gain this domain, how do we build a team and a team culture where you're still here in 3 and 4 years when you become the expert? Versus you've gained that domain, become the expert, and now we restart, which means there's what the company does to ensure retention overall, but there's what does the design team do to keep these problems interesting, to build a design team culture that matters. And that's, by the way, where things like design leadership and ensuring design is appreciated matters a lot, because now the decision becomes harder to move into an organization that doesn't have that level of appreciation for design. But yeah, the domain is we look at how can you gain it. The other quick thing is, we were talking the other day about an interesting thing we haven't tried yet, but I think it's really cool, which is, I forgot the actual word, the actual name for the method, but basically how can you make the problem you're solving, how can you think of the problem you're solving within the context of some other problem that's really similar in an industry that you understand?
Yeah.
So there are really complicated problems about how do we schedule things and how do we put things in different places. And one of the interesting things we've been thinking about is hotels have solved that problem for occupancy.
Analogous experiences.
Right, exactly, analogous experiences, thank you. So basically the idea that other industries have solved similar problems. How can you use that experience or that expertise, even if the domain knowledge is not 100% there yet?
Yeah, and there's actual value in that beginner's mindset. And I think, if anything, we struggle more to keep that beginner's mindset after we become really familiar with a topic, right? None of our members, or many of our members, don't know what an APR is, but we're all burdened with the fact that over time we'd learned all these things far too well. We definitely prioritize discipline knowledge over domain knowledge. And I believe in that transferable skill, and that however, I think that keeping a team relatively stable, so we very rarely lift and shift a whole team. We'll try to get individuals onto different projects or problems based on their need to grow horizontally or have something fresh and new. So we try not to have whole team brain drain, but at the same time, we do encourage fresh problems, even for folks who have been at USAA for a while. That helps.
So with that, I want to thank you for joining us at this panel at Spring One, and thank you for our wonderful marketing team and our organizers that made this happen, and thank you for all attending.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you.